and up to verse 6. And I kind of have a predilection of not liking to jump just right in the middle of a passage, so I'll go ahead and read it. Starting at verse 1 again, and then we'll pick it up at verse 6. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. Because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. So verse 6, for this reason you pay taxes, for they, the rulers, are God's servants, being devoted to this very thing. If you have my hand up, that's great. Now if you don't, I don't have any more with me today.
Listen.
Now, for this reason, that's a phrase you find often in the writings of the Bible, that kind of thing, that connects the preceding with what's coming after it. So, the preceding becomes a basis, the reason for the next statement. So, you pay taxes for this reason. So then, to understand what that reason is, you got to go back, right? And so then what we go back to is like verses 4 and 5, particularly verse 4, for the authority is the servant of God for you. Skipping a couple of lines in that verse, for it is the servant of God, avenger for the purpose of wrath, regarding the one who does bad. So the governing authority here has a purpose as servant of God. And the purpose is what Paul is saying there in verse 4. So what does taxes have to do with that, we might ask? Yeah, Russ.
Pays the police.
Well, okay, they have bills to pay, right?
They have to pay for services and all things.
Yeah. So I mean, as a basic, proposition, the governing authority, well, so let's think about this then in a different way. What is the governing authority not engaged in? It's not engaged in commerce, right?
Right.
Well, I mean, so in terms of what it's supposed to be, right? But in terms of its basic function, it is not engaged in commerce, which means it is not engaging in business to make money by which it supports itself, like citizens are, right? This is a concept that also applies to in the church, by the way. But any kind of office that God has established that is not for the purpose of commerce, in order for it to be able to function, needs to have revenue somehow, right? So I think that's how we should understand, so therefore you pay taxes, because Paul says in that verse 6, they are devoted to this very thing. So being devoted to the thing they're devoted to, which is not engaging in business, they need to be able to have revenue somehow. And in that very legitimate enterprise, there are expenses and bills to pay, right? Well, thanks, Tony. So, and that's how it looks to me in terms of, asking the question, well, why taxes? Any comments or questions about that? I think that's pretty easy to see, but we at least start fleshing it out, right?
Can we ask them to use our taxes for something we...
Well, so yeah, immediately now we jump to the questions, debates, concerns about whether government is using taxation for its proper purposes. Well, I actually have that in the comment on that in the implication thing. I think the only thing we want to say in here for our purposes, it is not necessarily the purpose of the church, right, to engage in those kinds of debates and solve those kinds of questions, right? It's in the civil realm.
So as citizens?
As citizens, yeah, engage in that debate, especially here in America where no taxation without representation, right? But we've said this again, we said this before in other kinds of connections, how important then it is for there to be public debate. But again, that's over on the civil realm. But what we are recognizing from the standpoint of God's purposes that we are being taught by God's word here is that they need to have revenue to do their job. Because the business they're engaged in is not making money. Yeah, Jonathan?
I was just wondering if that dynamic gets complicated as government, whether it's local or state or federal, all three levels are engaging in some commerce. They are selling some products, whether it's water treatment or hunting license or Amtrak, post office. That's commerce. Does that complicate? So it's not just taxes. There's lots of charges, fees for things that complicate government's role from our perspective.
I'm not sure. I don't know how you would, what you're thinking that how it would. This is all pretty general from what Romans 13 is saying. Those kinds of specific questions are working out of government policy and all that. Fees, I don't know if I would call fees necessarily commerce. Like buying a fishing license, for example, theoretically, it has a purpose that the government is doing in being a steward of the natural resources. That's not, I don't know that that's quite like selling a product at a profit. But I don't know, what do you, when you say complicate, what are you thinking about?
Well, the legitimacy of taxation, or how a Christian should look at governments legitimately taxing, does that legitimacy get tempered? I don't know what the word is there. A little, because government also makes money in other ways that aren't taxes.
Well, and maybe that's covered in verse 7 a little bit. But I think just from the standpoint of Christianity, what the question we're answering here, a couple of questions are related to one another. One is it legitimate from the standpoint of Christianity for the government to engage in taxation? Just as a basic proposition.
Yes.
The answer is clearly yes. The answer that, we recognize they have a purpose, there's a reason why for that. What was the next one? Oh, the next one is, and it follows from that, is, well, should I as a Christian, this kind of took us back to the beginning in verse 1. The Verse 1, we ask the question, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. Why is that even in the book of Romans, which is all about the gospel and the Christian life? Well, we talked about how there could have been Christians maybe back in those days. You say, Jesus Christ is Lord, and then you conclude, oh, wow, that's cool. I'm a law unto myself with respect to the government, and I don't have to pay taxes because I'm a Christian. That point of view is thoroughly dismissed here by the Spirit through the apostle. So those two questions: is taxation legitimate from a Christian perspective? Yes, generally speaking. Do I as a Christian then pay taxes as a matter of conscience? Yes. And that's about the extent of, I think, where we can go from the standpoint of the Scriptures. And when we start getting into debates about what is appropriate taxation, what the government activity is this tax, is it commerce, is this whatever it is, that I think is on the civil side. As citizens using reason. And, our Christianity does contribute to that, I guess, in certain ways, but not necessarily in having formulas to give precise answers. Those got to be worked out in the civil realm, I think. I don't know if that gets there, but that's how I see it. Lori, you had your hand up, did you?
Well, I am a tax collector. One of my many jobs I do.
Dun, dun, dun.
Not my favorite job. So also I do accounts payable. So when I see a lot of the bills that come in that the city pays using said tax money to pay for things that a lot of people don't even realize what the city handles. Like the city of Glenwood just lost or had major damage to their water infrastructure with the Grizzly Creek fire.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
A lot of our taxes are going to fix that system. In fact, the taxes aren't even going to cover it. So there's loans in place. But seeing it from that perspective, I've gotten a taste of, okay, yes, the city provides the streets, the infrastructure for the water, the infrastructure for the power. All of these things are interworked. Even business licenses, sales tax licenses, all of that stuff. It really does, on a local level, keep that city going. And is that system perfect? No. I mean, things don't happen quick enough, a lot of people think, but I've really kind of seen how it all comes together, how dependent upon the city running smoothly and nicely is your sales tax, your local income tax. It all does work together really well, I think.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. I got a feed on my phone yesterday. It comes out of MIT. It was just aerial photographs of some cities around the world contrasting the rich and the poor. I can't remember where this was. Where was this one? Is it Sao Paulo? Brazil? Anyway, had this aerial photograph with, the middle class to upper middle class on one side of it, and then the lower class in their shanty shacks just across the road. One of the comments made was in the caption that area not only is really poor, but they don't have infrastructure for running water, sanitation, electricity. I've thought about this in other respects over the years. Before, when I was practicing law, for a number of years I was doing construction defect litigation, and that involved the planning process, and then you get involved with how infrastructure is developed and all of that. And I realized what a great blessing it is. And it's not, you shouldn't to be here in this country that has all that. You can't take it for granted across the world. You know, why? Why is that?
Even the poor here have that infrastructure.
Right, even the poor here have the infrastructure. Right? Now, there are ways the government works all that out. But like I said, if we disagree with something, it's got to be a matter of debate. But yeah, Lori, I appreciate those comments. Let's see, I'm looking for render unto Caesar. I thought it was Matthew 22, but I guess it wasn't. Anyone know where that is?
I'll know in one moment.
Render to Caesar.
It's in the New Testament.
Yeah, I think. Thank you, Susan. That's yeah, in the gospel.
It's in the gospel.
In the gospel somewhere. It's okay. Mark 12. Let's go to Matthew 22. It wasn't Matthew 22. It's also in Mark.
There it is, 15.
Oh, there it is.
15.
What's that? Yeah.
Mark 12:17.
So if you turn to Matthew 22, starting at verse 15. The Pharisees, they're starting to conspire here, and they figured out, oh, here's how we're going to catch Jesus so we can get rid of him by lawful means. So they sent some disciples to him along with the Herodians. The Herodians were a group of people in the Jewish society who were supporters, kind of a party supporting Herod. And that also means that they were this seems like a contradiction, right? They were sort of in support of, in cahoots with the Roman government, because Herod was King Herod the Great of the Christmas fame was appointed by the Romans. They come to Jesus and they say, so, they butter him up. We know that you're a teacher, true teacher from God. So tell us, and you don't care about anyone's opinion. Is it a lawful, verse 17, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Now you can hear behind this, from the Pharisees' standpoint, they hate the Romans. And you can hear behind this, well, Jesus, if you're a good Jew and you teach the way of God in the kingdom of Israel truthfully, then you're going to say no. Right?
Interesting.
So if you're a Christian and you follow Jesus who is Lord, I don't have to pay taxes. But Matthew here is in the Jewish context in relation to the Romans. Jesus was aware of their malice. He said, show me the coin for the tax. By the way, I've seen they've been uncovering some of these in the last few months. It's pretty interesting. Yeah, they uncovered one, I think, from Caesar Augustus. And there it is, the inscription on the coin of the Roman emperor. But the famous thing Jesus says in verse 21, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. I think that is also reflected, obviously, in much different language in what Paul says in verse 7, back to Romans 13. Pay to everyone what is owed. If you owe taxes to Caesar, pay taxes to Caesar. If you owe Caesar honor and respect, if you owe the government honor and respect, pay the government honor and respect. at the end of our time last week, I said this in a different way. The gospel, this is a kind of a way that we've said it in our Lutheran tradition. It's in the confessions. The gospel does not overthrow the legitimate purposes of government. And actually, I was thinking about that throughout the week, and I think, actually that's probably even a deeper explanation for what's going on here in Romans 13 is just, that is being illustrated and taught. That the gospel does not overthrow, generally speaking, the legitimate purposes of government. And then this passage spells out, well, what are those purposes and why and so on. But taxes must be paid to support government. By the way, you can also run what Jesus says the other direction, which we also talked about a little bit last week, right? Render to God the things that are God's. The church is to stay in those things, in that business, right, so to speak. Not cross the line over to the civil as the proper purpose and functioning of the church. In other words, we have, the church and the state have their own purposes and functioning, and they, generally speaking, should leave each other alone. In an ideal world, right? Yeah, Kathy.
So you may not want to answer this now, so just say forget it.
Okay.
If you don't. So, I totally get all of that, and I'm totally about paying taxes, but now that we're entering into a time where mostly in federal taxes, our taxes are going towards things that are very, very obviously contrary to God's law. But the problem is we can't sort out what of our taxes are going to good stuff and what of our taxes are going to bad stuff. So we're basically going to just have to pay our taxes and let God handle it from there, correct?
Well, from the Christian standpoint, yeah.
Yes, that's what I'm talking about.
From your standpoint as a citizen, you do what is available to you to
Vote and all of that stuff.
Yeah, and even as the church, I mean, depends on the specific issue we're talking about. But if we're talking about state-funded abortion, for example, which can happen, politicians figure out ways of doing this that don't sound like directly supporting abortion, but that's another matter.
Right.
Well, the church, I think the church as a church does have the responsibility to say, to be kind of a prophetic voice to government and say, that's not right. And then in terms of the particular solution is to say, if you're going to do that, at least carve out exceptions for people so that they don't violate their conscience. But there is a place where the church has a prophetic voice to use in speaking to government about certain things. But again, the weapon of our warfare is the Word of God, right? And so that's why I say it's a prophetic voice. It's the voice of speech, of speaking God's Word to government. We can do that. I use the word church there because I think that's kind of a better place for that. I mean, you can do that as a Christian on an individual level to some extent. But I think even to do that, you've got to get together, right? So you're not doing it alone.
Right.
But like we also said last week, well, that reminds me. What is our ultimate recourse from the standpoint of being Christians and the church? Well, we're going to be suffering injustice. I mean, it is anarchy, right? If we all just start thinking, well, because I'm a Christian, I can individually decide, I can send in 70% of my tax bill I mean, that just really doesn't work.
Yeah, because you don't know where that 70%'s going. I
Yeah.
mean, you
It
know,
could go straight to what you didn't want it to go to, yeah.
Yeah, so,
So, I mean, this is why it's so important again and again, freedom of speech, public debate, the ability to dissent. We've been blessed in this country by those things being sacred principles of government, and how critically important it is to preserve those things. And that should not be a partisan issue. The thing that I said reminds me is taking a quick look at what Peter says. 1 Peter chapter 3, I think it is. It's chapter 4. First Peter chapter 4. It's a passage that starts at verse 12. It says, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you." Our experience in America here makes that sound, well, that is strange. "But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings. If you are," verse 14, "if you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you." But then verse 15, "Let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. If anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name." So if we have to suffer for being Christian at the hands of the government, we are blessed. "But let none of us suffer as an evildoer." That's another way of tying back into our discussion last week about conscience in verse 5. But also about what recourse do we have, ultimately, if the government goes bad case scenario, right? Worst case scenario. Let's see. God's servants. By the way, this is back to Romans 13:6. This is just kind of a point of interest. I have a note there, note 2 in my notes, about the word servant there. The Greek word there is this word leiturgos. And it generally means to serve in a public office. But then I also point out that there are 4 different words in English. There are 4 different words in Greek for our English word servant, or that we use our English word servant to translate. But there are 4 different words in Greek. It's kind of like the word love. There are like 3 or 4 different words in Greek that we bring in each word into English by the word love. One of the words is our word here, liturgos. Another word is actually back up in verse 4, I believe. God's servant. There the word is diakonos. Diakonos, which has a little different connotation to it. There's the word doulos, which is Romans 1:1. Paul, an apostle of Jesus. What does he say? Paul, an apostle Romans 1:1. I'm in Acts.
Paul, servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, as set apart in the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures.
Yeah, right. Thanks. So Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ. The Greek word there is doulos, which also is the word for slave. Diakonos doesn't have necessarily the connotations of slave in it, but doulos does. So Paul calls himself a doulos of Christ Jesus. And then there's also in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, so doulos, I am owned by Christ Jesus, and he can dispose of me as he wills. I think that's what the Apostle Paul is trying to get across with the use of that word. But then 1 Corinthians 4:1, this is how one should regard us as, the word servant in English. But there, the Greek word is hyperetas. Isn't that word interesting? This is just kind of an aside, but you have 4 different words in Greek with different connotations to them that we bring into English with our single word servant.
So what's that one?
Well, hyperetas, I think the closest thing to think about in English or in our world is like an agent. An agent. So if you read that verse, 1 Corinthians 4:1, with that kind of thought, with the word agent, then it reads, thus, let a person regard us as agents of Christ and stewards of the mysteries, or managers, house managers of the mysteries of God. What is an agent? An agent represents a principle, right? So if you hear the word of the agent, and that agent is representing the principle, it's the word of the principle. Right?
An example in today's world would be?
Oh, like if you're selling a house, and you have a real estate attorney, well, attorney is an example too. A real estate agent, and as a seller, you're the principal, and you authorize the agent to tell the prospective buyer, maybe the buyer's agent, yeah, I'll sell it for X amount of money. The buyer takes it as the word of the seller when they hear the agent saying that. Yeah, Gene.
Could it also be an advocate?
No, because here the concept is representation. Well, I suppose, I guess Paul does advocate. But advocate, I think, brings us into another context. I think the simple thing here is just Paul as the apostles are the representatives of Christ. So when they're acting within the scope of that representation, you take their word as the word of Christ. Well, hopefully you found that interesting. Unfortunately for you reading English, you're not able to tell which Greek word is it behind that now.
Can we just call you?
You can call me, yes. Send me a text, yeah.
Bible Hub is good at that, by the way, because you can actually, it'll show you the Greek word, and so.
Well, yeah, but it's probably in Greek letters, so.
Yeah.
That won't help me.
Huh?
That wouldn't help me.
Yeah.
Look, it looks different.
I think because I asked kind of the same question she did before, about, well, what can we do about this tax if we don't like where it's going? The hardest part that I have found is, I know in my heart that I can work on the civil level with my Christianity, but like you said, you have to know how to go about it and maybe have a group of people help you, because the only way I think Christians make the best difference is by doing it together and creating, you said, if you're gonna do that, then create a way for us to give people the other side of the story and the option to make a choice. And it's hard to keep people involved in that, because then you are grassroots and you're not really attacking the government. You're trying to show people that as citizens, we have a choice and we can make our choice and we can work together on these choices. And if you're a Christian, you also have the opportunity to show them Christ's love. But keeping that going is hard in the civil realm if you're not a leader.
Yeah.
A lot of people are just followers.
Yeah.
And that's kind of their gift, that they'll follow and sign up, but getting them to stay on that track is hard.
Yeah.
So that you're not feeling like you're carrying it all again yourself, But I think Christians can make a difference that way.
Certainly.
Yeah.
I mean, we, Missouri Synod, for example, we are a part of and support, I don't think it's just a Missouri Synod thing, the March for Life, which I think takes place is it February?
I think so.
Yeah, I'm in Washington, D.C. Millions of Christians band together to show the government we don't approve of abortion. Actually, it's not we, it's a bigger message. God doesn't approve of abortion.
Yeah, no. But then taking that next step, if you're going to say, we really wanted you to do this, and they're not willing to pay for that to be done, or seeing that that's being done, you could make a difference if you knew how to set that up in the civil realm and help people see it. And maybe we could borrow some tax dollars from the government to do it. Borrow. I'm kidding. I'm just saying.
Well, isolation is probably one of the biggest, most effective weapons of governmental type of tyranny. And one of the ways I think the totalitarian governments work is to isolate individuals and then do something to them. That's why what you're saying is so important. Getting together, communicating with each other, building grassroots relationships. Because isolation is a very effective weapon of revolutionaries and totalitarian governments. You're a lot weaker if you're alone than if you're together. Of course, revolutionaries also abide by that principle, right? So
Yeah, right.
the mob is a lot more powerful than one individual by themselves. That's a negative side of that. I guess it's kind of concerning today in our culture. I mean, because we have lived in under such a good government for so long, and we've just been allowed to worry about our own little lives, which nothing wrong with that, but we get sort of atomized, isolated from each other. And I wonder, and then with the onslaught of, well, maybe this isn't fair, I don't know, it's an interesting thing to talk about, but I was going to say the onslaught of social media, but maybe television did that 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Where instead of getting together and going to the supper club or going out to eat or going to your friend's house and playing cards until midnight, what do? You sit in your own living room all by yourself. I mean, there's nothing specifically wrong with that, except when you look at it on a societal scale, there's a generation that's gone that experienced social interaction in a way that is not natural to me. I don't know, but I think you're raising a really good point about isolation and banding together and that kind of thing.
I've heard that called the town square phenomenon, that those interactions where we come together, all of those many institutions that we have created over time in this country where we do things together for whatever purpose, entertainment or whatever, and how powerful that is a force against isolation, against totalitarianism, and how those things, those entanglements that we all have that bring us together, those things are diminishing. Part of it's technology.
Oh, go ahead.
Wouldn't that also what's going on now with the virtual meetings? You're sitting in your own living room, and everybody else is in their own living room, you know, and you're just watching them on a TV set or a computer screen. You know.
I think the one caveat to the criticism of that, the technology, in my mind is,
It's good now.
what's that?
It does do some good.
Yeah, you actually are communicating.
Yeah, you are.
So I think we want to maybe get some young people in here to ask them some questions about social media. You know, that's just like, you know, their device is attached to their hand, like their head is attached to your arm. You know? And, you know, just sending out a text to your friends, you know.
Should we text them then and invite them?
Well, we asked the
Very
question a
seriously.
couple months ago, would you rather lose an appendage or lose your phone? And they said, oh yeah, like I can lose my pinky, no problem, but never have a phone again.
Yeah.
It was like, no, I can live without my pinky, I can't live without my phone. You know?
Yeah. Well, so do they feel socially isolated because of that technology, or do they feel socially connected? I do think there's a phenomenon growing among the younger generations of realizing the limitations of technology and longing for more real face-to-face, in-person socialization. Yeah, you want to say something,
I
Kirsten?
think social media brings a false sense of socializing.
Yeah.
Because you're not getting that face-to-face time, you're not making true connections with people.
Yeah.
What I think social media takes away from that, and it gives you a false sense of true friendships and true relationships.
Well, it's easier to hide behind words too, that are just
Yeah,
typed
it is.
instead of face to face.
Yeah.
And not everybody puts their, you know, everybody on social media typically puts their best self up.
Or worse.
Or their
So-
worst.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
They're protected.
Yeah.
So right now, I'm really angry about this and what they just said. I don't really know this person.
Yeah.
But it was in my feed, so I'm like, I'll tell you what I think about that. Okay, guess what? It's really hard to be, it's hard to be Christian in those. I mean, this is where your sinful nature, like, whoosh, and then it's gone, and it's out there.
Be careful of those knee-jerk emotional reactions. It's so easy to, or an email came out, you know,
Yeah.
20 years ago. That's old fashioned by now, right?
Yeah.
So easy to sit at your keyboard and fire off a response, right?
Yes.
Rule of thumb that I learned practicing law, also in some personal things, is, okay, fine. Do your email, save it as a draft, take a deep breath, come back tomorrow, and look at it again. Be careful of hitting that return button. Because email, I don't know what it is about electronic communication. This is why emojis have developed, because it fails to convey the emotion and the connotation, the attitude of the sender, and it can come off more often than not sounding like judgment, condemnation, criticism, the communication of anger, and even worse things. Yeah. Take a deep breath. And then you probably will realize in the morning, you know what? I shouldn't probably send this. Or
with text messaging,
Or,
set your phone down before you.
maybe I'll just pick up the phone and call. Or maybe I'll just go over there and talk face to face. Now let's see, what do we want to get? Are we done with verse 6? Let's just wrap this up. I think, verse 7. It's an interesting verse, but pay to everyone what is owed. The word there is obligation in the Greek. So, render to whoever the obligation you owe to that person. Taxes to the one to whom tax is owed. These words here are interesting in the Greek, and the ESV says, someone have the ESV handy? I'm still in Matthew in mine. I think it said revenue. The next one said revenue.
Yes.
Yeah. Another way of translating that word is like duties. Maybe this is kind of related to what you were asking about, Jonathan, like duties, when you're shipping, importing something into a country, a duty, a tariff, right? That kind of thing. Yeah, not a duty of behavior, but a charge from the government to import. That kind of thing. Fear to the one whom fear is owed. Honor to the one whom honor is owed. But even for Paul to be talking like this is, look, honor Caesar, respect Caesar. Fear Caesar to the extent Caesar's operating within the proper function of Caesar being a servant of God for the function of government. But coming back then, I think to wrap up, we've been dealing with this though in those bookends, for lack of a better picture, those bookends. Government is God's servant for a specific purpose. The one bookend is totalitarianism. I think we can say that the Holy Spirit's not teaching us here to accept government as totalitarian. Because the government's God's servant, so the government is accountable to God. And its purpose is a limited purpose. On the other end was anarchy. And this is clearly teaching that God is not an anarchist. How all that works out in actual life all the way in between, there aren't necessarily formulas being set forth here. But the government has a purpose. The church has a purpose. We want to be careful not to commingle them so we undermine either one of those purposes. And thank God for the government we've lived under for a long time. And pray that it be preserved. Anything else anyone would like to say? I think we'll move on to verse 8, which is a different topic next week. All right. Doxology.